If you've ever boarded an airplane at night, you'll know how quiet that moment can be. It wasn't a pleasant silence. Rather, it was the silence of people too tired to talk, too rich to be curious, and too accustomed to things going their own way. The first-class cabin on Aurora Air Flight 781 from Chicago to San Francisco that evening was bathed in soft yellow light. The seats were cream-colored leather, glasses were neatly arranged. The faint scent of roasted coffee mingled with the cool metallic smell of the aircraft. Everything was in its proper place, until that girl walked in. Before the story begins, if you're new to the channel, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Not for the sake of the algorithm, but because stories like these, you only need to listen once and you'll see yourself in them. Now sit still, because this story isn't noisy, but it will linger for a long time. The girl walked slowly. It's not the slow pace of someone seeking attention, but rather the slow pace of someone who's exhausted and simply trying to get to where they need to go. She wore an old gray hoodie. Not torn, not dirty, just not new. Dark blue jeans, worn out white sneakers. On her shoulder was a simple canvas backpack so light it looked almost empty. No jewelry, no designer bags, no expensive headphones. She glanced at the seat number, then stopped. 1A. She bent down, put her backpack down, and sat in the chair by the window. And in the first-class cabin a very strange moment occurred. Nobody said anything, but many people were watching. Those eyes weren't angry, not curious. They were just scrutinizing. Like when you see an item in the wrong place and your brain automatically thinks, "This doesn't belong here." In the back seat, a man in a sharp suit raised an eyebrow. A middle-aged woman closed a magazine halfway through. An elderly couple looked at each other, then at the young girl, then back at each other, and then Margaret Hale saw her. Margaret had worked for Aurora Air for nearly 25 years. She stood near the front galley, her navy blue scarf neatly adjusted, her name tag gleaming in the lights. Margaret was proud of this first-class cabin, not because of the salary, not because of the privileges, but because she believed she was the one setting the standard. Who should sit here, who shouldn't? When Margaret's gaze settled on seat 1A, the familiar smile on her face froze. Just a second, but long enough for a decision to be formed. She walked over. "Excuse me." Margaret's voice wasn't high, not harsh. In fact, it was quite soft, the kind of voice people use when they're absolutely certain they're right. The girl took off her sunglasses and turned around. Her eyes were red, not the kind of red from being drunk. Rather, the kind of red from someone who had cried too much and had no more tears left to shed. Yes, Margaret smiled, but her eyes didn't. "Are you sure you're sitting in the right place, sweetie?" The girl looked back at the seat number. Then she looked at Margaret. "Yes. Seat 1A. Margaret chuckled softly, a short, sharp laugh as if she had just heard an innocent joke. "These seats are first class," she said. "Your ticket is probably at the back." The girl was silent for a moment. Then very slowly she took out her phone. "Here you go." The screen lights up. Electronic boarding pass. Name displayed. Margaret didn't take it. She only glanced at it. Then he shook his head. "Sweetie," she said, her voice lowering, "first-class tickets on this flight aren't cheap, and our passengers don't usually dress like that." A few people nearby heard it. No one intervened. No one said anything. The girl took a deep breath. In that moment, many thoughts flashed through her mind. She can say who she is. She can make a phone call. She can end this in 10 seconds. But she didn't do it. She simply looked up, met Margaret's gaze, and said, her voice weary but clear, "I paid for this seat, and I just want to sit still." Margaret stood up straight. The first-class cabin was still quiet, but it was no longer pleasant. At an altitude of over 3,000 feet, something very fragile is beginning to crack. And no one on that plane knew that the girl in the hoodie in seat 1A was more than just a passenger. She is the one who has the power to change the fate of everyone watching her right now. But that is a story for the sequel. First-class cabins aren't the place for much conversation. It was a place where people observed in silence. After Evelyn's words, no one in the plane spoke. But that silence had changed in nature. It was no longer the relaxed tranquility of those about to fly over 2,000 miles across America. Instead, it was a tense, fragile stillness like the surface of a pane of glass that would shatter with the slightest touch. Margaret Hale stood there, her hand resting lightly on the armrest of seat 1A, her nude nailed fingers tapping a very small rhythm. She doesn't like it when people say no to her. It wasn't because of power. It was because throughout her 25 years in the profession, Margaret had become accustomed to things going exactly as she predicted. What do rich people look like? How do wealthy people behave? And who doesn't belong here? For her, first class was more than just a seat. It was an order. And that order has just been challenged by a girl in a gray hoodie. Margaret tilted her head, her voice still soft but devoid of any friendliness. Could you stand up for a moment? We need to clarify this before takeoff. Evelyn didn't stand up right away. She leaned back in her chair, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes gazing out the window. On the runway, the white lights reflected off the aircraft's fuselage, stretching into faint streaks of light. She felt a heavy weight in her body, not from exhaustion, but from a very familiar feeling, the feeling of having to prove one's existence. She's experienced this feeling too many times already. In the meeting room when asked, "Whose assistant are you?" In the elevator, someone handed her a guest card even though she owned the entire office floor. And now at an altitude of less than 1,000 feet, on a commercial airplane, that feeling has returned. Evelyn turned to look at Margaret. "I've shown you the ticket," she said, her voice even. "If you need verification, you can scan the code." Margaret's lips curved slightly. "We don't need to scan," she replied. "I've worked here long enough to know who the first-class passengers are." A man in seat 2C let out a soft cough. It was unclear whether it was due to discomfort or simply because the air in the cabin had become heavy. An elderly woman clutched the strap of her handbag tightly against her lap. She said nothing, but her eyes were fixed on Evelyn. Evelyn sensed it all. She sensed gazes that weren't necessarily malicious, but were full of scrutiny. The questioning gazes asked, "Who are you? Do you deserve to be here?" And going deeper, if she weren't the CEO's daughter, would things be different? Margaret held out her hand. "Give me your phone," she said. "I'll check it." Evelyn looked at that hand. The hand that had once served champagne to politicians. The hand accustomed to giving orders. "She didn't give me her phone." "No," Evelyn said very softly. A few people gasped. Margaret paused for half a second. "No," she repeated. "I'm not comfortable with her holding my phone," Evelyn said. "She can use the company's device to check." Margaret let out a long sigh. Not from exhaustion, but from self-restraint. "You're making things more complicated than necessary," she said. "And I don't want to have to call security." The word security was clearly heard throughout the airplane cabin. It carries its own weight. It makes people recoil. It makes people want to stay away from trouble. Evelyn swallowed hard. A silent dialogue was taking place in her mind. "I can end this right now. Just one phone call, one name." But then the image of my mother came to mind. Her mother once said, her voice tired but warm, "You don't always have to tell the world who you are just to be treated kindly." Evelyn squeezed his hand gently. "I wasn't causing a disturbance," she said. "I was just sitting in my seat." Margaret turned around and gestured to a young flight attendant standing nearby. "Lucy," she said, her voice low, "check the manifest." Lucy hesitated for a moment. The young woman glanced at Evelyn, then at Margaret. "Yes." Lucy opened the tablet. Her fingers scrolled quickly. Margaret crossed her arms over her chest. She was certain she was right. Lucy stopped. "Margaret," Lucy's voice trailed off. "Seat 1A is Evelyn Brooks." Margaret spun around, and she said, "There are many people with the same name." Lucy swallowed. The tickets were purchased directly from a corporate account, she said. First class, no last-minute upgrades. The airplane cabin seemed to hold its breath. Margaret gave a faint smile. Corporate accounts don't mean anything, she replied. It could be that the ticket was transferred. Evelyn looked at Lucy, catching her confused and guilty gaze. She didn't blame the young girl. She understood what it felt like to be caught in the middle. Margaret took another step forward, standing very close. "This is the last time I'll say this," she said. "If you don't get up, I'll call the captain." A moment passed. Evelyn closed her eyes. In just 1 second, she thought of the empty house after the funeral, the armchair her mother used to sit in, the scent of chamomile tea still lingering in the kitchen. She was so exhausted that she no longer had the strength to fight. But then she opened her eyes. "Go ahead and call," Evelyn said. Her voice didn't tremble. "But I won't leave my seat." Margaret stood up straight, turned her back, stride toward the cockpit. Her shoes echoed clearly in the narrow passageway. The first-class cabin remained silent. But now no one thinks this was just a minor misunderstanding anymore. And Evelyn, sitting quietly in seat 1A, knew she had just crossed a line. "It's not because I want to cause trouble, but sometimes if you stand up too many times in your life, there comes a point you can only sit back and not move." Ahead, the cockpit door closed, and what happens next will change the entire flight. As the cockpit door closed behind Margaret Hale, the first-class cabin entered a very different state. Gone was the sharp tension of a direct confrontation. Instead, there was a heavy silence, like after a thunderstorm has passed, but the sky remains undecided whether it will clear up or continue to rage. Evelyn Brooks remained seated in seat 1A. She didn't look at Margaret, nor did she look at the other passengers around her. She looked out the window. Below the plane's wings, the runway of O'Hare Airport receded into the distance, its rows of white lights stretching like thin threads. The city of Chicago shrank, its skyscrapers becoming mere dark geometric shapes. The plane shook slightly. Then it stabilized. Evelyn exhaled, a long sigh as if she had been holding it in for a very long time. Lucy, the young flight attendant, stood a few steps away. She awkwardly adjusted her name tag, then stepped a little closer. Do you need any water?" Lucy asked softly. Evelyn turned around, smiling very slightly. "It's all right," she replied. "Thank you." Lucy nodded, then stepped back. Her eyes held a mixture of guilt, respect, and confusion. Evelyn understood. She used to be Lucy, once caught between two sides, knowing what was right but lacking the power to speak up. She turned back to face the space in front of her. Inside the airplane cabin, everyone pretended to return to their own world. The man in seat 2C opens his laptop. A woman is wearing noise-canceling headphones. Someone is flipping through a magazine. But Evelyn knew that with just one more slight movement, all those eyes would turn to her again. She has lived with that her whole life. Evelyn Brooks was not born into wealth. She grew up in Oakland, California, in a small house with an old wooden porch and a lemon tree in the front yard. Her father, Marcus Brooks, is a self-taught software engineer. Her mother, Lorraine, is a night shift nurse at a public hospital. Money isn't much, but discipline is. Marcus always said to his daughter, "You don't need to speak loudly for others to hear. Just speak the truth." Lorraine said, "Never let anyone make you feel like you have to ask permission to exist." Those words haunted Evelyn for years. They followed her to Stanford University, where she was one of the very few black students in the engineering department. Follow her into the meeting rooms where she's the youngest and often the only one who's different from the rest. And that's how she's stayed with me to this day. The day she returned from her mother's funeral. Lorraine Brooks passed away 2 days ago. Suddenly, a mild stroke during her night shift. She didn't get to say goodbye. Evelyn stood by her mother's bedside for a long time, holding her hand and looking at the wrinkles around her mother's eyes that she had never noticed before. She wore this hoodie throughout that evening. It wasn't because it was pretty. It was because it was the coat her mother often borrowed when the weather turned cold. "Your coat is warmer," my mother used to say, smiling. Evelyn didn't want to change it. Not today. She just wanted to go home, to sit quietly, to not have to explain anything more. But it seems the world didn't grant her that privilege. A small noise was heard from the front. The cockpit door opened. Margaret Hale stepped out, followed by a tall man in a pilot's uniform, Captain Daniel Wright. He was in his 50s with graying hair and sharp yet calm eyes. He flew for Aurora Air for nearly 30 years. He witnessed all kinds of passengers and all kinds of situations. But the moment his eyes met Evelyn's, his steps slowed. Just one beat, but it was enough for Lucy to realize. And enough for Margaret to sense that something was wrong. Daniel walked closer to seat 1A. "Miss Brooks," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it resonated clearly in the first-class cabin. Evelyn looked up. She saw surprise in his eyes. And something else too, respect. "Captain," she replied, nodding slightly. Margaret stood frozen behind them. She hadn't expected this. She never imagined that the captain she'd known for so many years would call that girl by her first name as if they'd met before. Daniel glanced quickly at Margaret, then turned back to Evelyn. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "It seems there has been a misunderstanding." Evelyn looked at him for a second. Then she shook her head. "That's all right," she replied. "I understand." Daniel pursed his lips. He understood better than she thought. He turned to Margaret. "Margaret," he said, his voice lowering, "I need you back in the galley right now." Margaret opened her mouth. "Captain, right now," Daniel interrupted. Not loudly, but firmly. Margaret paused. Then she turned and walked away. This time the sound of her shoes was not as confident as before. The first-class cabin exhaled. It was as if someone had just opened an invisible door. Daniel got back together with Evelyn. "I'm very sorry," he said. "We'll make sure no one bothers you again." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you," she said. Daniel hesitated for a moment. "I heard about your mother," he said in a lower voice. "My sincere condolences." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She nodded again, not believing she could say anything more. Daniel stepped back to the cockpit. The aircraft cabin returned to its original state, at least outwardly. But inside something had changed. Evelyn closed her eyes. She thought it was all over. Little did she know that behind the galley curtain Margaret Hale stood there, her hands clenched, a dangerous thought beginning to form. And that thought would propel this story further than anyone on this flight could have imagined. Behind the galley curtain, Margaret Hale stood still for a long time. It wasn't because she was ordered to stand there. It was because she wasn't ready to move on. The steady hum of the airplane engines echoed from behind, a sound so familiar that for Margaret it had once been a source of security, but not right now. Her hands rested on the cold stainless steel tabletop, her knuckles turning slightly white from clenching them tightly. In Margaret's mind, the scene kept repeating itself. The way Captain Daniel Wright slowed down when he saw that girl, the way he called her name, and especially the look he gave Margaret when he turned. No anger, no yelling. It's disappointment. Margaret hated that feeling. It wasn't because it embarrassed her in front of the passengers. It was because it made her doubt something she had always believed to be true. Margaret Hale has been a flight attendant since she was 22 years old. She began her career during a time when the profession held a very different kind of prestige. Back then, uniforms had to be ironed perfectly flat, hair had to be tied back precisely, shoes had to be polished after each flight, and first class is sacred ground, Margaret learned very quickly. She learned to recognize regular customers, those with money but lacking manners, those who needed meticulous service, and those who were flexible. Those lessons weren't in textbooks, they were passed down orally, through glances, through subtle headshakes. And Margaret believed she had done well, very good. For many years she never received any serious complaints, never any disciplinary action. She was a role model for young flight attendants, a law enforcement officer, a standard-setting guard, until today. Margaret took a deep breath. Calm down, she told herself. It's just a small misunderstanding. But deep down she knew she didn't believe it. If it was just a misunderstanding, why did Captain America react that way? If he was just an ordinary passenger, how did he know her name? Margaret closed her eyes. A thought flashed through her mind, quickly, unpleasantly, and she tried to push it away. She might know someone, maybe a relative of a shareholder. Or worse. Margaret opened her eyes. That thought returned clearer than ever. Privilege. She had seen this before. People who weren't qualified were protected simply because of their connections. And in Margaret's world, that was dangerous. It disrupted order. She turned to Lucy, who was standing quietly nearby. "Lucy," Margaret said, her voice low. "That girl, did you notice anything unusual?" Lucy was startled. What do you mean, ma'am?" "Luggage, good manners, anything." Lucy hesitated. "She was quite calm," Lucy said, "and the ticket was correct." Margaret frowned. "Calm down," she repeated. "Either they are completely innocent, or they are very used to being protected." Lucy remained silent. Margaret turned away. She didn't need Lucy's consent. She just needed confirmation for herself. In the first-class cabin, Evelyn Brooks closed her eyes. She put on her noise-canceling headphones, but she didn't turn on any music. She just wanted to isolate herself from the world around her. Her heart rate gradually slowed. Her body began to relax. She thought it was all over, that she could get some sleep, that this flight would be just like any other flight. Little did she know that ahead of her, Margaret Hale was gazing at the galley curtain as if it were a door separating her from the answer she wanted to hear. Margaret glanced at her watch. Almost 15 minutes had passed since the plane took off. Long enough for the passengers to settle down. Long enough for no one to notice the galley ahead. She looked around. Nobody. Margaret took one step forward, then another. Her footsteps were very light. She had learned to move discreetly a long time ago. She stopped in front of seat 1A. Evelyn is asleep. Her face was relaxed, unguarded. Her hands rested lightly on the armrest. Under the seat, the gray fabric backpack lay neatly. Margaret looked at the backpack. No logo, no expensive lock, nothing special. But it was precisely that ordinariness that bothered her. She bent down. "It's just a security check," she whispered, as if talking to herself. Her finger touched the zipper. 1 second passed. Then Margaret zipped it up. The sound was very faint, almost inaudible. She opened the backpack slightly. Inside were very ordinary things. A notebook, an empty water bottle, a used tissue. Margaret frowned. She searched deeper, and then her fingers touched something hard. She pulled it out. One bottle of medicine, then another bottle. Margaret squinted. Drug label, patient name, dosage. She didn't read carefully. She only noticed one thing: prescription medication, not registered under Evelyn Brooks's name. Her heart was beating faster. Margaret continued searching. A thick envelope. She opened it. Cash. Not too much, but enough to make her gasp. "I know," Margaret whispered. Everything fit together in her head in the way she wanted to believe. Privilege, concealment, relationships. Margaret put everything back into her backpack, zipped it up, put it back in its original place. She stood up straight. Look at Evelyn one more time. The girl was still asleep, peaceful, as if unaware that in just a few minutes her life would be thrust into the brightest spotlight. Margaret turned away. This time her steps were unwavering. A plan had formed in her mind, and Margaret Hale believed she had no choice but to see it through to the end. Because if she's wrong, then everything she's believed for the past 25 years will be wrong too. And that, for Margaret, was more terrifying than any other consequence. No one in first class noticed the moment everything changed. There were no loud noises, no pronouncements, just a vague sensation spreading through the air, like when the room temperature drops a degree and you don't know why you suddenly shiver. Margaret Hale returned to the main walkway looking completely different. If before she walked with suppressed anger, now, each step she took carried something very dangerous. Certainty. She had seen enough. She had found her own answer. And in Margaret's world, when someone believes they are upholding order, every subsequent action becomes justified. Margaret stopped in front of seat 1A. Evelyn Brooks still had her eyes closed. Noise-canceling headphones covered almost her entire face. Her breathing was even and slow. She looked like someone who had finally gotten some rest. Margaret stood there for a few seconds, observing. She didn't see Evelyn as a person. She saw her as an unresolved problem. Margaret raised her hand. "Miss Brooks." No response. Margaret tapped lightly on the armrest of the chair. Then harder. "Miss Brooks." Evelyn opened her eyes. It took her a few seconds to process. The lights, the faces, the voices standing right next to her. She took off her headphones. "What's wrong?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was hoarse from just waking up. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She turned toward the airplane cabin as if she needed an audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice slightly louder than usual, "we need to temporarily suspend service to address a security issue." A slight ripple spread through the room. Laptops closed. Headphones were removed. Eyes turned toward seat 1A. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "A security issue," she repeated. Margaret looked directly at her. "There are some irregularities regarding her personal belongings," she said, "and we need to clarify them." Evelyn blinked. "My luggage." "What are you talking about?" Margaret tilted her head. "We have discovered several items that do not comply with aviation safety regulations." A man behind them took a sharp breath. Someone whispered something indistinct. Evelyn stood still, not out of fear, but because she was trying to understand. "Did you check my luggage?" Evelyn asked, her voice lowered. Margaret did not answer directly. "Please stand up," she said, "and take your backpack. It's not a request. It's an order." Evelyn looked around. Lucy stood at the end of the aisle. The young girl's eyes were wide with fear. She shook her head very slightly, as if wanting to say something but not daring to. Evelyn turned to look at Margaret. "You have no right to do that," she said. "You can't search my luggage without my permission." Margaret pursed her lips. "We are handling a security situation," she replied, "and I am doing my job properly." Evelyn slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. At that moment she realized this was no longer a misunderstanding. This is a judgment. She stood up. The backpack was pulled out from under the seat. It was lighter than expected. Margaret held out her hand. "Give it here." Evelyn held tightly onto the backpack straps. "No," she said. "If you think there's a problem, call the captain or airport security." Margaret laughed. "Oh, I'll do that," she said. "But first I need to confirm a few things." Margaret Quay sang Lucy. "Lucy, you witnessed this." Lucy swallowed. "Yes." Margaret opened her backpack. The sound of a zipper clicking was very clear, too clear in the otherwise silent airplane cabin. She took out her notebook, then a tissue, then a bottle of water. "Nobody said anything," Margaret continued. She pulled out the first bottle of medicine. A very faint murmur was heard. Someone raised an eyebrow. Someone leaned forward. Margaret held up the bottle of medicine. "It's prescription medication," she said. "It's not in your name." Evelyn felt her heart skip a beat. That is, Margaret didn't let her finish speaking. "And here," she said, pulling out an envelope. "Cash." Margaret opened the envelope. The banknotes were revealed. A woman on the other side of the aisle covered her mouth with her hand. Evelyn felt her head spinning. "My mother just passed away," she said. Her voice was uneven. "It was Miss Brooks." Margaret interrupted. "You'll have a chance to explain." "But not now." Margaret turned away. "Captain Wright," she called out loudly. "We need you in first class immediately." The air became denser. Evelyn stood there in the narrow aisle, her backpack wide open in front of her. She had never felt so naked before. It wasn't because of the items that were pulled out, it was because of the way people were looking at her right now. It's no longer a scrutinizing gaze, it's suspicion, not doubt. She heard footsteps from ahead. Captain Daniel Wright appeared. He looked at the scene before him, the backpack, the bottles of medicine, the envelope of money. He frowned. "Margaret," he said slowly. "What's going on?" Margaret stood up straight. "Captain," she replied, "we discovered this passenger was carrying prescription medication of unknown origin and a significant amount of cash." "Daniel K.," sang Evelyn. Miss Brooks. Evelyn looked at him. She wanted to say so much. She wanted to explain. She wanted to put an end to this, but her throat tightened. "That's my mother's medicine," she said. "My mother just passed away. I brought it along to." Margaret folded her arms. "Captain," she said, "with all due respect, we cannot rely solely on words." Daniel remained silent. That moment lasted. And in first class everyone held their breath. Evelyn looked down at her hands. They trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because a very old feeling is returning, the feeling of having to prove that my pain is real, the feeling of having to turn personal losses into evidence. Daniel exhaled. "Margaret," he said, "go back to the galley. Now." Margaret froze. "Captain, I just—" "Now," Daniel repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but there was no room for argument. Margaret looked around. Those eyes were no longer on her side. She turned and walked away. But in Margaret's mind a decision had already been made. If this isn't handled on the plane, then it will be handled on the ground. And she knew exactly who she was going to call. Evelyn sat down on the chair. Lucy hurriedly gathered her belongings and put her backpack back under the seat. "I'm sorry," Lucy whispered. Her voice trembled. Evelyn nodded. "It's all right," she said, but her eyes were red. The plane continued flying westward. Outside, the sky was darkening, and somewhere in that darkness another storm was silently brewing. The first-class cabin had never been so quiet. It wasn't the quiet of relaxation, but a heavy, oppressive silence, like when a room full of people simultaneously realize they've just witnessed something terribly wrong. Evelyn Brooks sat back down in seat 1A. Lucy placed her backpack under the seat carefully, zipping it up as if trying to fix something she knew she had no right to fix. "I'm sorry," Lucy whispered again. "I'm really sorry." Evelyn nodded. "It's all right," she said. Her voice was very soft, so soft it barely touched the air, but inside she felt something shrinking. It wasn't anger, nor was it exactly sadness. Rather, it is the profound weariness of someone who has just been dragged into a crowd and forced to explain their pain to people who have no right to demand it. Captain Daniel Wright stood in the main aisle. He didn't return to the cockpit immediately. He took a quick look around the first-class cabin. The familiar faces of first-class passengers now wear different expressions. Some people were annoyed. Some were curious. Some avoided Evelyn's gaze as if her pain were contagious. Daniel took a deep breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low and clear, "please rest assured. There is no threat to the safety of this flight." Some people exhaled, but the air remained tense. Daniel Quay sang Evelyn. "Miss Brooks," he said more softly, "are you all right?" Evelyn looked at him. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to ease the tension. But then she remembered the moment the vials of medicine were held up. She remembered the envelope of money being opened. She remembered the look in the woman's eyes as she covered her mouth and stared at her as if she were something suspicious. "Not really," she replied. But then she smiled very slightly. "I'll be fine." Daniel nodded. His eyes darkened. He turned around and walked towards the galley. Margaret Hale was standing there. This time she didn't pretend to be calm. Her face flushed. Her teeth were clenched. Her eyes gleamed with something very hard. "Captain," she said as Daniel approached, "you're making a mistake." Daniel looked at her. "No," he replied, "you're the one who crossed the line." Margaret shook her head. "Don't you see?" she said quickly. "Prescription medication, cash, a passenger receiving special treatment. Do you really believe it's all just a coincidence?" Daniel was silent for a few seconds. "Margaret," he said slowly, "you searched passengers' luggage without permission. Do you know how serious that is?" "Is that more serious than ignoring a security threat?" Margaret retorted. Daniel looked directly at her. "She has no evidence," he said. "Only speculation." Margaret gave a faint smile. "Sometimes the experienced pilot's judgment saved the entire flight," she said. "He let personal emotions get in the way." Daniel frowned. "Personal feelings," he repeated. Margaret took a step closer. "He knows her," she said softly. "That's why he's protecting her." Daniel let out a long sigh. "Go back to your seat," he said. "Right now." Margaret looked at him. Then she looked toward the first-class compartment where Evelyn Brooks sat quietly. A chilling thought flashed through her mind. If Daniel doesn't act, then she will. "Yes, Captain," Margaret said. Her voice suddenly became submissive. "But I will take note of this." Daniel turned away. Margaret stopped. She watched him. She knew she had just lost a round, but the game wasn't over yet. The first-class cabin attempted to return to normal. Another flight attendant began serving water. The sound of glasses clinking, the rustling of snack wrappers. But nobody really focused on those things. Evelyn leaned her head back against the chair. She looked out the window. Below, the clouds stretched out like a gray blanket. The sun had set, leaving only a thin streak of orange on the horizon. She thought of her mother. Her mother hated airplanes. She always held her hand tightly every time the plane took off. "You know, my mother once said when people soar high, they forget how small they actually are." Evelyn gently closed her eyes. She wondered if she would ever be free from experiences like this again. Could it be that she was simply a passenger not representing anything at all? In seat 2C, the man in the suit leaned towards Evelyn. "Miss," he said softly, I don't know what's going on, but if you need help." Evelyn opened her eyes. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "but I'm fine." The man nodded. He withdrew his hand. His good intentions did nothing to ease her burden. They only reminded her that everything that had just happened had become a shared experience. A woman on the other side of the aisle looked at Evelyn, then quickly turned away when their eyes met. Evelyn realized that. She didn't blame them. She just acknowledged it. Up front, Margaret Hale had returned to her jump seat. She fastened her seatbelt. She sat up straight. Outside, the seatbelt sign was illuminated. Margaret stared intently at the wall in front of her. In her mind, the pieces were rearranging themselves. If Evelyn Brooks is truly innocent, then why was she carrying someone else's medicine? Why did she have cash? Why did Captain protect her? Margaret didn't allow herself to consider any other possibility. Because if Evelyn is innocent, then Margaret is wrong. And if Margaret was wrong, then her entire career and her entire set of values would be shaken. "No," Margaret thought. "It's impossible." She took her phone out of her pocket. She knew perfectly well that it was against the rules. But at this point, regulations are no longer important. She opened her contact list. She searched for a name. An old friend used to work in airport security in San Francisco. Margaret typed a short message. "There's a suspicious passenger on Aurora 781. Unidentified prescription medication. Cash. The captain is refusing to act." She paused for a second, then she sent it. The message disappeared from the screen. Margaret put away her phone. "Sit up straight." Outside, the plane continued its westward descent, hurtling through the night. Inside, a decision had just been made that no one else knew about. And that decision would turn suspicion into a confrontation that no one on this flight could avoid. Evelyn Brooks, seated comfortably in seat 1A, had no idea that when the plane's wheels touched down, she wouldn't be disembarking at the terminal like a regular passenger. It's not because she did anything wrong, because someone had decided that her silence was proof. When the cabin lights are dimmed, the first-class cabin is enveloped in a soft light, not dark enough for deep sleep, but gentle enough for people to begin to confront themselves. Evelyn Brooks remains in seat 1A. She didn't turn on her entertainment screen. She didn't read a book. She didn't listen to music. She just sat there looking at her faint reflection in the window. His face looked calm, but only Evelyn knew that a never-ending dialogue was taking place inside. Let them call security. It'll all be over quickly. That thought flashed through her mind, then disappeared. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she knew that a quick ending wasn't always a good ending. She had chosen that path before, revealing her identity, using her power to put an end to the doubt. And each time she felt like she was losing something very small but very important. Option. The right to be a normal human being, not a symbol, not proof of any social argument. Evelyn inhaled slowly, then exhaled. She remembers the day she was appointed CEO. The room was filled with handshakes, congratulations, and polite smiles that day. And then, as people started leaving, an older man pulled her aside. "You know," he said, "you're a very bold choice." Evelyn smiled. "Do you think so?" He laughed. "I mean, it's not every day you see someone like you sitting in this position, a person like her." That phrase stuck with Evelyn for a long time. It needed no explanation. It carried with it all the prejudices. And now, on this plane, that phrase reappears. Not in words, but in their eyes, in their actions. Evelyn pulled the thin blanket up a little higher, not because she was cold, but because she needed a boundary. She turned to the right. In seat 2A, a middle-aged woman was pretending to be asleep. Evelyn knew she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was too regular. Her shoulders weren't relaxed. She turned to the left. The seat was empty. A profound silence. Another thought crept in. What if I were someone else? What if I didn't have Marcus Brooks as my father? What if I didn't have an entire legal team at my disposal with just a phone call? The answer is very clear. Things could have taken a different turn. Perhaps Margaret wouldn't have been stopped. Perhaps the vials of medicine would have been confiscated. Perhaps she would have been escorted off the plane in front of hundreds of people. That thought didn't scare Evelyn. It saddened her. Not for myself, but for all those who had no other choice. In the front, Captain Daniel Wright is seated in the cockpit. He took off his hat, set it down, rubbed his forehead. In his 30 years of flying, he'd handled all sorts of situations: drunk passengers, arguments, threats. But he had rarely felt as helpless as he did now. It's not that he didn't know the right thing. Rather, the right thing lay among the things not written in the procedure manual. He remembers his first meeting with Evelyn Brooks very clearly. Not on an airplane, but at a technology conference 3 years ago. Evelyn stood on the stage, speaking about artificial intelligence and ethics. Her voice was low, slow, clear. Daniel didn't fully understand the content, but he remembered how he felt at the time. This woman knows what she's talking about, and she doesn't need to prove it. When he recognized her on the flight today, a part of him felt relieved. Another group is worried, because he knew that Evelyn Brooks' presence would subject all his decisions to closer scrutiny. And Margaret Hale wasn't the type to accept that. Daniel glanced at his watch. There are still more than 2 hours of flight time. He exhaled, preparing for what was to come. In the passenger compartment, Margaret Hale sat in the jump seat in front, seat belt fastened, back straight, eyes looking forward, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. The message has been sent, and she's waiting. Margaret didn't see her actions as revenge. She saw them as a responsibility. Throughout her career, she has witnessed cases being overlooked because the people involved had connections. And each time she told herself that if she had the power, she wouldn't let it happen. Today she has the right. She didn't think of Evelyn Brooks as a child who had just lost her mother. She thought of her as a variable that threatens the order she has dedicated her life to protecting. Margaret closed her eyes. Just a little more verification is needed, she thought. If she's innocent, everything will be clear. She overlooked a small detail. that she herself made the decision and reached a conclusion before verifying it. Lucy walked down the aisle, gathering up the leftover glasses of water. Every time she walked past seat 1A, she glanced at Evelyn. She wanted to say something. She wanted to apologize again. She wanted to say that not everyone thinks like Margaret. But then she remembered the first time Margaret corrected her. "You have to learn to see the risks," Margaret once said. "Don't be too soft-hearted." Lucy nodded. But tonight she wasn't so sure anymore. Lucy could clearly see that Evelyn hadn't done anything. She just sat there, silent, calm, and that very calmness made things worse. Because in a world accustomed to the accused having to justify themselves, silence is often seen as an admission of guilt. Lucy bit her lip. She wished she had the courage to say it. Evelyn opened her eyes. She sensed Lucy's gaze, and she smiled, a very small smile. Not to reassure, but to say, "I see you." Lucy paused for a second, then she nodded very slightly. That moment was brief, but it was enough for Lucy to remember it for the rest of her life. The plane shook slightly as it entered a small area of turbulence. The seatbelt sign lights came on. A few people adjusted their posture. Evelyn fastened her seatbelt. She placed her hands on the armrests. She closed her eyes. In her head, her mother's voice echoed. "You can't control how other people see you," Lorraine Brooks once said, "but you can always control how you stand." Evelyn took a deep breath. She didn't know what awaited her upon landing. She didn't know what Margaret had been doing behind her back. But she knew one thing: she will not apologize for existing. And if someone wants to turn her silence into evidence, she will let the truth speak for itself. The plane continued its descent westward. The darkness outside deepened, and somewhere ahead a point of contact is approaching, slowly, inevitably. The lights in the aircraft cabin dimmed even further. It wasn't because the night had gotten deeper, but because the Boeing 787 began to descend silently, steadily, like a carefully regulated breath. The engine sound changed very subtly. If you're not used to it, you won't notice. But for those who have flown a lot, it's the sound that signals the beginning of a new phase. Captain Daniel Wright looked at the control panel. Altitude decreasing, speed steady. He pressed the intercom button. "Cabin crew, prepare for descent." His voice was calm, professional. But deep down, Daniel knew this landing wouldn't be like any other. Evelyn Brooks opened her eyes when she heard the announcement. She pulled the blanket down and sat up a little straighter. At that moment she felt time shrinking intensely. The remaining flight hours weren't long enough to avoid it, not short enough to end it. She looked out the window. Below, the lights of San Francisco began to appear like a shimmering carpet, undulating along the hilly terrain. A familiar city, where she built her career, where she once stood on stage and spoke about fairness, about choice, and now she's back there as a suspect. Evelyn placed her hand on her stomach. Her breathing was even. She reminded herself, "There's no need to rush. The truth won't run away." In the front seat, Margaret Hale stared at the seatbelt sign. She received a response, not a long message, just a short, cold sentence. "Noted. Someone will be waiting at the gate." Margaret read the words twice. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from excitement. She felt she was doing the right thing. Eventually, someone would check. Eventually, the truth would be revealed. Margaret lifted her head. Through the galley curtain she could see the back of seat 1A. Evelyn Brooks remained seated, unmoved, showing no signs of anxiety. That calmness irritated Margaret the most. If she was innocent, Margaret thought, then everything would become clear when she confronted by security. And if not, she continued, then we would have prevented a risk. Margaret didn't allow herself to consider a third possibility. Lucy walked down the aisle, checking the seatbelts. When she reached seat 1A, she lingered longer than necessary. "We're about to land," Lucy whispered. "Are you?" "All right." Evelyn looked at her. Yes, Evelyn replied. Thank you. Lucy nodded, but didn't leave immediately. She lowered her voice even further. I don't know what will happen, Lucy said. But I trust you, Evelyn smiled. This smile wasn't meant to hide fatigue. It was an acknowledgement. That makes sense, Evelyn said. Thank you. Lucy straightened up. She continued working. But deep down, a decision had already been made. If things go too far, she won't stay silent. The sound of the landing gear of the aircraft preparing to land echoed. A low, muffled clunk sounded a slight vibration throughout the aircraft. Many passengers straightened their backs. They gathered their belongings. A man behind Evelyn whispered to his companion. Something's wrong, he said. I saw them rummaging through her things. It could be security, the other man replied. Who knows? Those words weren't spoken loudly, but Evelyn heard them. She didn't turn around. No reaction. She'd heard things like that her whole life. Captain Daniel Wright stepped out of the cockpit once again. He walked along the first-class cabin, his eyes scanning quickly. He stopped when he got near seat 1A. Miss Brooks, he said, after landing there might be a slight delay in disembarking. Evelyn nodded. I guess so, she said. Daniel hesitated for a moment. I don't agree with how this is happening, he said softly. But there are things that have been triggered beyond my control. Evelyn looked at him. She saw sincerity in his eyes. He did what he could, she said. I know. Daniel exhaled. Whatever happens, he said, please know that you are not alone. Evelyn nodded again. Daniel turned away. The plane vibrates a little more when passing through a layer of wind. The clatter of luggage in the overhead compartments could be heard. A few gasps of breath. Then very suddenly, everything settled down. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeong Captain Wright Vang Len Kwa Loa. We've begun our final approach into San Francisco. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Evelyn closed her eyes. In that moment she thought of her father, Marcus Brooks. Marcus always said, when you walk into a room and feel like you don't belong, it doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means the room isn't ready for you yet. Evelyn pursed her lips. She didn't know if the moment that was about to come would be the time when this room would have to change. The plane touched down. A smooth landing. The sound of the wheels rolling on the runway lingering. A few passengers clapped softly, as was their habit, but the atmosphere in first class was far from relaxed. The plane didn't turn directly towards the familiar gate. Evelyn realized it even before anyone told her. Through the window she saw the plane heading toward a more distant area where there were fewer lights and fewer people. A man exclaimed, "Why don't we go through the gate?" A woman frowned. "What's up?" The plane stopped. It wasn't in front of the bridge. Instead, it was an empty area surrounded only by flashing traffic lights. The airplane cabin was buzzing with activity. Margaret Hale unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her voice rang out clear and firm. "Please remain seated," she said. "There's a small matter that needs to be resolved before we disembark." Evelyn opened her eyes. Her heart was beating slowly, but strongly. Through the front window, red and green lights flashed in the night. Not a refueling vehicle, not a baggage vehicle. It's an airport security vehicle. Lucy stood frozen at the back of the compartment. She saw Margaret, she saw the lights. And then she looked toward Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn stood up. "Don't rush, don't resist." She adjusted her hoodie, pulled her backpack over her shoulder. She took a deep breath. And for the first time during the flight, Evelyn Brooks was preparing to step out not as a passenger, but as someone about to be brought to light for a judgment she had never asked permission to make. The front door began to open. A cold air mass is coming in. And along with it came footsteps ascending the airplane's stairs. The front door swung open completely. A stream of cold, salty air from the San Francisco Sea poured into the cabin. It carried the smell of metal fuel and a very distinctive feeling, the feeling of irretrievable moments. Heavy footsteps echoed on the movable staircase. No hurry, no noise, but it was enough to make everyone in first class look up at once. Two airport security officers appeared first. Following them was a man in a dark suit, his collar neatly turned up and a walkie-talkie attached to his ear. Not the police, not the FBI. But they weren't the ones who came to greet me either. Margaret Hale stood in the aisle, back straight, hands clasped in front of her stomach as if she had been waiting for this very moment all flight. "Good evening," she said, her voice firm. "Thank you for arriving so quickly." The man in the suit nodded. "We have been notified of a situation requiring verification," he said. "Please indicate the passenger involved." Margaret didn't turn around. She raised her hand and pointed directly at seat 1A. "Over there," she said. "Evelyn Brooks." A very slight wave of motion spread throughout the compartment. A man took a deep breath. A woman clutched the strap of her handbag. Someone whispered an incomplete sentence. Evelyn Brooks stood still. She had been standing since the door opened. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder. Her arms hung loosely at her sides. She didn't look at Margaret, nor did she look at the eyes that were fixed on her. She looked straight ahead. Captain Daniel Wright stepped forward. He stood between Margaret and the security team like a final dividing line. "Hello," he said. "I am the captain of this flight." The man in the suit nodded. "We just need to talk to the passengers," he replied. "No further disruption." Daniel looked over at Evelyn. "Miss Brooks," he said softly, "would you like?" Evelyn shook her head. "That's fine," she said. "I'll cooperate." Her voice was even, not shaky, not hurried. That confused many people, even more than the resistance itself. Margaret Hale observed from the side. In her mind, this moment should have brought a feeling of victory, but instead she sensed something was wrong. Evelyn didn't panic, she didn't argue, she didn't beg. She just stood there as if she were entering a meeting rather than an interrogation. Perhaps she's become too accustomed to being protected, Margaret thought to herself. She clung tightly to that idea. The man in the suit took a step forward. "Miss Brooks," he said, "please come with us off the plane to verify some information." Evelyn nodded. "I understand," she replied. She walked towards the door. Each of her footsteps echoed clearly in the silent airplane cabin. No one said anything. No one moved. Lucy stood at the back of the compartment, her hands clasped tightly. She wanted to run forward. She wanted to say something. But her throat tightened. Evelyn walked past Lucy. She paused very quietly, just loud enough for Lucy to hear. "You didn't do anything wrong," Evelyn said. "Don't let this make you forget that." Lucy nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Evelyn continued walking. "As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the cold air seeped into my hoodie. The airport lights blazed brightly. Long shadows stretched across the wet concrete surface. A security vehicle was parked nearby. The back door was open. The man in the suit gestured. "Please." Evelyn walked over, but before getting into the car, she stopped. She turned her head and looked up at the plane. Through the small windows, she saw faces looking down. Some were curious. Some were worried. Some avoided her gaze. And at the airplane door, Margaret Hale was standing there. The two looked at each other. No words, no gestures, just a glance. Margaret realized that immediately. There was no hatred in Evelyn's eyes. There is no contempt, just tired. The weariness of someone who has become all too familiar with being put in a position where they have to prove they deserve it. Margaret turned away first. The security vehicle rolled away. Inside, Evelyn sat in the back seat, her hands resting on her lap. The man in the suit was sitting opposite. "Miss Brooks," he said, "we need to ask you a few questions." "Yes," Evelyn replied. "Do you have any prescription medication with you?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "It's my mother's medicine, not registered under her name or not. And cash." "It's a refund from the funeral service," Evelyn said. "My mother passed away 2 days ago." The man took notes. He looked up. "Do you have any identification?" Evelyn looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It's on the phone, and I believe that if needed, my lawyer can provide more." The man stopped writing. "Your lawyer?" he asked. "Yes." A moment of silence passed. "What do you do for a living, Miss Brooks?" he continued to ask. Evelyn looked him straight in the eye. "I am the CEO of North Star Dynamics," she said. The answer fell into the car's trunk like a heavy object. The man blinked. "Excuse me," he said. "You said," CEO Evelyn repeated, "North Star Dynamics." The man looked at the walkie-talkie. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "Can you confirm that Evelyn opened her phone? No rush. No fuss." She held the screen towards him. The man read it. Then he read it again. His expression changed. Meanwhile, on the plane, Captain Daniel Wright was standing in the aisle. The passengers began to murmur. "What's going on? Did they really take her away? She doesn't look like—" Daniel raised his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "please maintain order. We will provide updates when we have more information." Margaret Hale was standing a few steps away. She felt her heart beating faster. "It wasn't because I was nervous. It was because of a very strange feeling. It's like when you realize you've moved a chess piece without looking at the whole board." The security vehicle stopped in front of a small building near the runway. Inside is the verification room. Evelyn stepped out. The car door closed behind her. The man in the suit quickened his pace. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I need to apologize for—" Evelyn raised her hand. "We'll just follow the proper procedure," she said. "I understand." They entered the room. White light, a metal table, a screen. Another woman walked in. She was holding a tablet. "We just checked the information," she said. "You are—" "Yes, that's right." She looked up, her gaze shifting from suspicion to confusion. "We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Evelyn nodded. "I just want to go home," she said, "and let this end." The man in the suit took a deep breath. "We'll get her back to the plane right away," he said, "and there will be a full report." Evelyn stood up. Deep down she felt no sense of victory. It's just a quiet sadness, because she knew that without that title things would have been very different. The security vehicle turned around. The plane is still waiting. The airplane door opened again. Evelyn walked up the stairs. This time the gazes directed at her were different from before. There was surprise. There was embarrassment. There was confusion. Margaret Hale stood at the door. When Evelyn approached, Margaret avoided her gaze. Evelyn stopped. "She may have done what she thought was right," Evelyn said, her voice low. "But sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the risk we imagine but the prejudice we refuse to acknowledge." Margaret did not answer. Evelyn stepped into the compartment. The plane was finally preparing to unload the passengers. But none of them knew that this was just the beginning. The airplane door closed again. The cold wind no longer rushed in. The red and green lights no longer shone into the cabin. But the atmosphere inside had completely changed. Evelyn Brooks walked slowly down the first-class aisle. Every step she took was no longer scrutinized with suspicious eyes but with an emotion harder to name: surprise, confusion, and somewhere in there a belated sense of shame. She didn't look at anyone. She just walked. Lucy was already standing by seat 1A. When she saw Evelyn turn around, she immediately bowed her head. I'm so glad you're back," Lucy said, her voice trembling slightly. Evelyn put her backpack down and sat in the chair. "Thank you," she replied. "You were very brave." Lucy blinked. She didn't think she'd done anything brave. But in Evelyn's eyes, Lucy saw an acknowledgement she had never received from Margaret. Lucy turned away, feeling a slight lightness in her chest. Captain Daniel Wright stepped out of the cockpit. He wasn't holding a microphone. He wasn't making any announcements. He stood in the middle of the first-class aisle, visible to everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice low and slow, "thank you for your patience." Some people nodded. Some still avoided Evelyn's gaze. Daniel took a deep breath. "The matter has been clarified," he continued. "There were no security breaches. There was no misconduct on the part of the passengers." A wave of exhaled breath spread throughout the cavity. Daniel paused for a moment. "And I want to make one thing clear," he said. The way things unfolded does not reflect the standards that I or Aurora Air aspire to uphold. That statement fell like a small stone but created wide ripples. Margaret Hale stood at the front, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair. She didn't turn around, but every word Daniel said struck her in the back. Daniel turned his head to look towards seat 1A. "Miss Brooks," he said, "on behalf of the crew, I apologize to you." The first-class cabin was eerily silent. A public apology, no ambiguity, no beating around the bush. Evelyn looked up. She didn't stand up. She didn't speak. She just nodded. "Thank you," she said. "Just 2 words, but that's enough." In the back seat, the man who had been whispering to his passenger now bowed his head. A woman adjusts her handbag, avoiding looking straight ahead. The truth once spoken is not as noisy as an accusation, but it's heavier. Margaret Hale remained standing still. Everything became blurry in her mind. It wasn't that she didn't hear. It was that she heard too clearly. That apology wasn't just for Evelyn. It is a judgment, not as effective as punishment, not as effective as scolding, but by acknowledging that something has gone wrong, and the passenger was not at fault. Margaret felt her throat dry up. For 25 years she believed she understood the world. She believed that experience allowed her to recognize risks. She believed that strict discipline kept things safe. But for the first time she wondered, what if I was wrong? That question is more terrifying than any consequence. Evelyn Brooks sat still. She didn't feel as relieved as people might think. She recalled the moment she was escorted off the plane. "I remember the harsh lights. I remember the dry, blunt questions. I remember the feeling of everything private being dragged out into the cold light." A part of her is still there. Evelyn picked up her phone, not to call her lawyer, not to call her father. She opened her email. A new message has arrived. Topic: Are you okay? Sender: James Holloway, Chairman of the Board of North Star Dynamics. Evelyn read it. Then she smiled very softly. The news spread faster than Margaret expected. Up front, Margaret Hale was called into the galley. Daniel stood there. Beside him was a ground manager from the airline. "Margaret," Daniel said, his voice not angry. "We need to talk." Margaret nodded. She went inside. The curtains were drawn shut. Outside, the passengers couldn't hear anything. But deep down, every word carries weight. "She contacted airport security without going through me," Daniel said. "I did what I thought was right," Margaret replied. Her voice was no longer as confident as before. "She searched the passengers' luggage," Daniel continued. "Do you know what that means?" Margaret remained silent. "Ground management speaks out." "Margaret Hale," he said, "we will suspend her immediately." Not firing anyone. Not yet. But it was enough for Margaret to understand that an era had come to an end. She nodded. "Yes," she said. Her voice trailed off. No tears, no resistance. There was only a feeling of emptiness. The curtain opened. Margaret stepped out of the compartment. The familiar upright posture was gone. The controlling gaze was gone. She walked past first class for the last time during this flight. When she got close to seat 1, Margaret stopped. She didn't look at Evelyn right away. She took a deep breath. "Miss Brooks," she said, "perhaps I was wrong." Just one sentence, but it took 25 years to utter it. Evelyn looked at her. In that moment, Evelyn had many ways to respond. Silent, cold, or bitter. But she didn't do that. "I hope she will start seeing other people not just through the lens of her familiarity," Evelyn said. "The world has changed." Margaret nodded. Then she turned away. No one applauded. No one said anything. But this silence was different from before. It is not the silence of judgment. Rather, it is the silence of thought. Lucy stood at the back of the compartment watching Margaret. She felt sad. But she also felt clearer than ever who she wanted to become. Finally, the airplane doors opened for passengers to disembark. No more security cars. No more flashing lights. It's just a familiar airport corridor. First-class passengers stand up. Collect your luggage. Prepare to board. The man in seat 2C stopped in front of Evelyn. I'm sorry, he said. I was thinking. Evelyn raised her hand. It's all right, she said. Thank you for saying that. The man nodded. Continue on. Another woman looked at Evelyn, hesitated, then smiled very slightly. Evelyn replied. It wasn't because she needed acceptance. It was because she understood that everyone was learning. Evelyn Brooks stood up. She slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked out into the hallway. As she walked past Lucy, she stopped. I'll do well, Evelyn said. Don't doubt it. Lucy bit her lip, then nodded emphatically. Evelyn stepped off the plane. The corridor was long and brightly lit. With each step she felt a little lighter, but deep down she knew the story wasn't over yet. Because when the truth is revealed, a bigger question will arise. Who will be held responsible for what happened, and who will change things so that this doesn't happen again? The San Francisco airport corridors were longer than Evelyn Brooks had imagined. It wasn't because it was actually a long journey, but because each step now carried the lingering echoes of what had just happened. The fluorescent lights shone brightly. The polished stone floor reflected the shadows of people passing by. The sound of rolling suitcase wheels echoed, and announcements resounded from the loudspeakers in the distance. Everything looked perfectly normal. But for Evelyn, things had deviated from their familiar course. She stepped out of the arrival area. Her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. Once, then twice, then consecutively. She stopped near a large glass pillar and took out her phone. Text messages, emails, missed calls. It all happened at once, as if someone had just flipped a switch. The first message came from James Holloway. We've heard the preliminary information. If you need it, our legal team is available, but the decision is yours, Evelyn read slowly. James was always like that. No pushing, no imposing. The next message came from Aisha Reynolds, Director of Communications for North Star Dynamics. At least 3 passengers have posted videos. Some clips are going viral on X and TikTok. The press will be calling within hours. Evelyn closed her eyes. She knew this would happen. But knowing and feeling are 2 different things. She put the phone down. She took a deep breath. Outside the window, the city of San Francisco was falling into night very quickly. The sea breeze was cool. The yellow lights of the highway stretched out like an endless stream. Evelyn stood still for a moment. She didn't call a taxi right away. She didn't want to rush. She needed a few minutes to ask herself a very important question. What should I do next? In another corner of the airport, Margaret Hale sat alone on a staff waiting bench. No more uniforms, no more neatly tied scarves. She had changed into a simple gray coat. Her handbag lay at her feet. In front of her was the phone, its screen still lit. A message from Aurora Air's Human Resources Department. The suspension decision is effective immediately. Please refrain from contacting the media until further notice. Margaret read it again. Don't get angry. Don't argue. It's just an empty space. She thought back to the moment she stood at the airplane door when Evelyn looked at her. There was no schadenfreude. There was no retaliation. Only exhaustion remains. Margaret never thought she would become someone who would cause so much trouble for others. Lucy was standing not far away in the area reserved for flight attendants. She was holding the phone, her hand trembling slightly. A video just appeared on the screen. The title is very clear. First-class passenger detained after suspicious behavior. Airline responds. Lucy clicked on it. The video was filmed from the back seat. She saw Evelyn's back. She saw the backpack open. She saw Margaret standing in the way. Comments are coming in very quickly. Something feels off. Why does she look so calm? This is messed up. Lucy turned off the video. She didn't want to watch any more. The question kept repeating itself in her mind. If I had spoken up sooner, would things have been different? Evelyn finally called a taxi. When the car stopped, the driver looked at her through the rearview mirror. Hello, he said. Where are you going? Pacific Heights, Evelyn replied. The driver nodded. As the car started moving, the radio switched on the late-night news. A first-class passenger on Aurora Air Flight 781 was detained for security verification. The airline said no threat was detected. Evelyn looked out the window. The city stretches on, familiar slopes, houses with lights on. She wondered what her mother Lorraine Brooks would say if she were still alive. Perhaps my mother would just shake her head and say, "My child, sometimes people aren't afraid of you making mistakes. They're afraid of you becoming too firmly established." When Evelyn arrived at her apartment, she didn't turn on the lights right away. She put her backpack down. She sat down on the sofa. The room was strangely quiet. She opened her phone again. An incoming call. No name displayed. Evelyn hesitated. Then she picked up the phone. "Miss Brooks." A male voice, slightly urgent. "Yes, I'm Daniel Wright," a familiar voice said. "Captain of the flight." Evelyn sat up straight. "Hello, sir," she said. "I just wanted to check if you got home safely," Daniel said. "And to say I'm so sorry." Evelyn was silent for a few seconds. "Thank you for calling," she said. "And thank you for being there when things weren't clear." Daniel exhaled. "There are days," he said, "when people realize that process alone is insufficient without courage." Evelyn smiled. "He showed that courage today," she said. They said goodbye. The call ended. The phone vibrated again. This time it's Aisha. "Evelyn," Aisha said quickly. "CNN and Chronicle have both sent interview requests. We need to decide now." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "What was the public reaction?" she asked. "It's divided into two," Aisha replied. "One side is asking questions about security. The other side is speaking frankly about discrimination. But the video is shifting." Evelyn closed her eyes. She didn't want to turn this story into a big heated argument. But she also didn't want it to fade away as if it had never happened. "Aisha," Evelyn said slowly, "if I speak, I don't want to speak to defend myself." "So what do you want to say?" Aisha asked. Evelyn opened her eyes. "Because of those who don't have business cards to hand out," she replied. "Because of those who aren't asked for their profession before being suspected." Aisha remained silent. "I want to say it," Aisha said, "but in my own way." In another apartment, Margaret Hale was also sitting alone. The TV is on, but the sound is low. The evening news is replaying the video. Many people believe that passengers were treated unfairly. Margaret turned off the TV. She picked up her phone. She opened the messaging app. A name appeared, Tom, union rep. She typed a few words, then deleted them, typed them again, then deleted them again. Finally, she put the phone down. For the first time in her life, Margaret didn't know what to say. "It's not because I'm afraid of losing my job, it's because I'm afraid of facing my own image." Lucy arrived back at her small apartment in Daly City. She put the bag down. Then she plopped down on the bed. The phone vibrates, a message from another younger colleague. "Did you see what happened on Flight 781? It looked terrible," Lucy typed a reply. "Yes, and I think we need to talk about it." She sent it. Her heart was racing. Lucy didn't know where that conversation would lead, but she knew that silence was no longer an option. Evelyn stood up. She turned on the light. The room lit up. She went into the bedroom and hung her hoodie on the chair. She looked at it for a long time. The shirt is simple, no brand, no frills. But today it has become a symbol she never wanted. Evelyn turned away. She took out her laptop. She opened a blank page, not for writing press releases, not for preparing interviews. She began typing the first lines. "I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. I only know one thing. This story isn't just hers, and if she doesn't tell it in the most honest way possible, someone else will in a less humane way." The sky in San Francisco brightens very slowly. There was no glorious sunrise. Just a faint, gray light filtering through the low-rise buildings and touching the window pane of Evelyn Brooks' apartment. She hadn't slept much. It wasn't because she was too tired, but because her mind kept replaying the small moments from last night's flight. The way Margaret stood blocking the walkway. The way her backpack was opened. the way her silence was interpreted as something suspicious. Evelyn sat in front of her laptop. The blank page was still open. The cursor blinked steadily, as if asking a very direct question. What should I say? The phone vibrates. A message from Aisha Reynolds. Good morning. The news is picking up speed. The hashtag number, Flight 781, is starting to trend. Evelyn read it. Then she put the phone down. She's not in a hurry. She brewed a cup of coffee. The aroma of hot coffee filled the small kitchen, creating a very ordinary feeling. That feeling is what led Evelyn to make her decision. She didn't need a perfect speech. She needed the truth told in a real voice. Evelyn turned back to her laptop. She placed her hands on the keyboard. And then I started typing. She didn't start with a flight. She started by talking about her mother. 2 days ago, I lost my mother. I wore her old hoodie on the flight home because it was the only thing that made me feel like she was still close. Evelyn stopped. She took a deep breath. Then she continued. I'm not writing this to apologize, nor am I writing to accuse anyone personally. I'm writing because I know that if I remain silent, this story won't end with me. The words appeared slowly but surely. Evelyn didn't mention her title. She didn't mention North Star Dynamics. She didn't mention her lawyer. She was simply recounting what happened from the perspective of someone placed in a situation where they had to prove their innocence. Elsewhere in the city, Aisha Reynolds was sitting in the small conference room of North Star Dynamics. The large screen continuously displayed viral videos. There's video of Evelyn being escorted off the plane. There's video of Captain Wright's apology. There are also short context-deprived clips being quickly pushed through. Aisha looked at her watch. She knew that the moment Evelyn spoke would decide the direction of everything. Margaret Hale woke up in her small apartment in Queens. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't watch the news. But her phone kept ringing. Messages from former colleagues, from a longtime friend, and from an unknown number. Margaret didn't finish reading it. She only opened one social media app. She scrolled very slowly. Then she saw it, a new post shared very quickly. The author's name is clearly displayed, Evelyn Brooks. Margaret hesitated. Then she pressed it. Lucy is reading that article too. She sat on the bed, laptop on her lap, her hands clasped tightly. Lucy read each line. No harsh words, no accusations. There are only sentences that make people stop and think. The scariest thing isn't being suspected. The scariest thing is when suspicion is taken for granted simply because your appearance doesn't match someone's expectations. Lucy felt a lump in her throat. She remembered Evelyn's expression when she was asked to stand up. It's not fear, it's disappointment. The article went viral. Not because it's sensational, but because it's slow. It forces the reader to slow down. The excerpts began appearing on X, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Security should never be built on assumptions about human nature. We can ensure safety without losing our dignity. The comments started to change. It's no longer just about arguing right and wrong. It's about personal stories being told. I've been through that at the store. I've been stopped at the airport. I used to think it was normal. Aisha called Evelyn. Did you just post something? Aisha asked. Yes, Evelyn replied. No edits, no press releases. Aisha was silent for a few seconds. The reaction was very strong, she said. But in a good way. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. I don't want this to be my story, she said. I want it to be a story about how we see other people. I've done it, Aisha said. Now the question is, are you ready to face the next step? Evelyn looked out the window. If I've already spoken up, she said, then I can't stop halfway. That afternoon, Aurora Air issued an official announcement. Concise, standard. We commit to reviewing our processes. We commit to retraining our staff. And we offer a general apology. But the public didn't stop there. The question now is no longer just a matter for one airline. Instead it is, how many more times has this happened without anyone knowing? Margaret Hale read to the end of the article. She wasn't angry. She felt naked. It wasn't because Evelyn called her by that name. She didn't do that. Because Evelyn named a type of thinking that Margaret had lived with for a very long time. Margaret put the phone down. She looked around the room, old photographs, fleeting memories, certificates of merit. For the first time, Margaret wondered if all of that was enough to define who she was. Lucy texted Evelyn. She types very slowly. "Thank you for saying something I didn't have the courage to say before." Evelyn read the message. She smiled. She replied, "You were brave from the moment you saw what was wrong and didn't turn away." Lucy read it over and over again. She felt that even as a young flight attendant she had a role to play. That afternoon Evelyn received an invitation. Not a television interview, not a talk show. Instead it was a closed-door dialogue with Aurora Air's leadership and a group of community representatives. Evelyn thought for a moment. She knew this was the moment when things could move from words to action. She replied, "Yes." As the sun sets, San Francisco is bathed in a soft orange glow. Evelyn stood on the balcony, a warm cup of tea in her hand. She didn't feel like she had just won. She felt as if she had just opened a door, and behind that door many people are waiting to be seen. Not to be defended, but to be recognized as complete human beings. Evelyn took a deep breath. She knew the coming days wouldn't be easy, but this time she wasn't alone. The meeting room is located on the 16th floor of Aurora Air headquarters. No large logo, no press backdrop, just a glass-enclosed room, a long wooden table, and soft white lighting. Evelyn Brooks arrived 10 minutes early. She wasn't wearing a suit. Just a cream-colored shirt, dark trousers, and her familiar flat shoes. She placed her backpack down next to the chair and sat up straight. Not to impress, but because she was used to having to be ready in rooms like this. The first person to walk in was Richard Coleman, Vice President of Operations at Aurora Air. He was in his 50s, with graying hair, a deep voice, and accustomed to tense meetings. "Miss Brooks," he said, shaking her hand. "Thank you for coming." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you for the invitation," she replied. Next came two others, a legal representative, and a middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Dr. Elaine Foster, an expert in equity policy and personnel training. Finally, Aisha Reynolds walked in and sat down next to Evelyn. Nobody engages in small talk for long. No coffee, no pastries. The atmosphere was polite enough, but tense. Richard spoke first. "We want to begin with an apology," he said. "Not just for the incident on the flight, but for what it represents." Evelyn listened. She didn't nod. She didn't react. "We've reviewed the video, read the public's reaction, and read her article," Richard continued. "It's quite blunt." Evelyn placed both hands on the table. "I didn't come here to receive an apology," she said. Her voice was calm. "An apology won't change the system." The room fell silent for a moment. Dr. Foster nodded slightly. "You're right," she said, "and that's why we want to hear from you." Richard took a deep breath. "We want to know," he said, "from your perspective, what went wrong." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room. "Not one person," she said slowly. "Not a single decision. Rather a series of assumptions that have become normal." She stopped. When someone enters what is supposed to be privileged space and their first reaction is suspicion, the problem isn't with that person. Aisha quietly took notes. "Security," Richard said, "is our top priority." "I don't deny that," Evelyn replied. "But security cannot be built on the stereotyping of people." Dr. Foster leaned forward. "Could you explain that more clearly?" she asked. Evelyn nodded. "When a process allows an employee to skip an objective verification step simply because they feel something is wrong, that feeling will always be driven by bias." No one objected, because everyone knows she's right. Richard looked down at the stack of documents in front of him. "We are reviewing the entire training program," he said, "but the public wants to see concrete action." Evelyn looked at him. So let's start with accountability, she said. Not just with the employees directly involved, but with the structure that allows it to happen. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. This is no longer a meeting of images. This is a face-to-face encounter. Elsewhere in the city, Margaret Hale was sitting in the small office of the union representative. The old room, yellow light. Tom Harris, the union representative, sat opposite her. "Margaret," he said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did you follow the proper procedures?" Margaret remained silent. Then she shook her head. "Not entirely," she said, "but I think I'm protecting people." Tom leaned back in his chair. "The problem," he said, "is that her feelings have replaced the process." Margaret looked down at her hands. She recalled the moment she decided to call security. No proof, just a feeling. And a belief that I cannot be wrong. Back to the Aurora Air meeting room, Dr. Foster asked a direct question. "Miss Brooks," she said, "what do you want us to do other than apologize and retrain?" Evelyn thought for a moment. She didn't come here with a list of requests. But she came here with a principle. "I want you all to listen to those who have never been invited into the meeting room," Evelyn said. Richard frowned. "What do you mean frontline workers?" Evelyn said. "Young people. People who witnessed it but didn't dare speak up." Aisha looked at Evelyn. She knew this sentence would change everything. "And I want Evelyn continued to have a safe channel for them to speak out without fear of repercussions." The room was silent. Richard nodded slowly. "We will consider it," he said. Evelyn looked straight at him. "No," she said softly, "you will. Or this story won't end here. No threats, no raising your voice. It's just a fact stated, very calmly." In the hallway, Lucy stood with a few other young flight attendants. They weren't invited into the meeting room, but they knew it was happening. "Do you think they'll change?" someone asked. Lucy didn't answer immediately. She thought of Evelyn's message. "Courage doesn't start with power, it starts with seeing." "I don't know," Lucy said, "but if they don't, we'll know." That statement silenced the entire group. It wasn't because of fear. It was because I realized I also had a role to play. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. There was no friendly handshake at the end. Their eyes were tired but more alert. Richard stood up. "Miss Brooks," he said, "we will get back to you within 7 days." Evelyn stood up. "I hope so," she said. Aisha tidied up the papers. As they stepped out of the room, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass corridor. Evelyn stopped. She looked outside. The city is still bustling, still full of untold stories. Aisha stood beside him. "Are you okay?" she asked. Evelyn nodded. "I'm not sure," Evelyn said. "But I know I can't go back and pretend nothing happened." Aisha smiled very slightly. "That's enough," she said. In her small apartment, Margaret Hale also stood by the window. She just received the official email. No firings, but an extensive internal investigation, and a request to participate in a reassessment program. Margaret finished reading. She didn't feel relieved, but she didn't feel devastated either. It's just a very strange feeling. Perhaps this was the first time she was forced to look back without being able to avoid it. Evelyn arrived home after dark. She took off her shoes. She sat down on the living room floor. "Don't turn on the TV. Don't open your phone. Just sit still." She thought of the people who had texted her, the stories they told, the old wounds. She knew she couldn't heal everything, but perhaps she opened a gap to let the light in. Evelyn stood up. Tomorrow there will be more calls, more articles, more debate. But tonight she allowed herself to simply be a person who had done what needed to be done, and rest. Saturday morning arrived with a false sense of calm. The sky over San Francisco was covered with thin clouds. The light was soft, not harsh. The city seemed to be holding its breath. Evelyn Brooks woke up earlier than usual. Not because of the alarm, but because of a familiar feeling she had whenever she faced an irreversible decision. She made tea. She sat by the window. She opened her laptop. "My inbox is full. It's not just about the press. It's not just about words of support. And there were the angry emails, the accusations, people saying she was overreacting. Evelyn read slowly, no response, no deletion. She knew this was the turning point. The phone vibrates. Aisha Reynolds called. "Have you seen the reaction yet?" Aisha asked. "Yes," Evelyn replied, "and I think it's time." Aisha was silent for a few seconds. "Are you sure?" she asked. "If you step out, there will be no turning back." Evelyn looked out the window. "I never had a way back," she said. "It's just that now everyone can see it." The press conference was arranged very quickly. No big stage, no bright lights. It's just an average conference room at a community center in Mission District. Evelyn chose that place intentionally. Not a company headquarters, not a luxury hotel, a place where people come to listen. On the other side of the city, Margaret Hale was also watching the news. She sat on the sofa, her hands clasped together. The TV showed images of preparations for the press conference. Margaret didn't know what she was waiting for. An accusation, an act of revenge, or is this simply the complete end of the old chapter? Lucy was at the community center. She wasn't there as a flight attendant, just as a listener. She sat in the middle row. She looked around. There were elderly people, there were students, there were airport staff, and there were even a few familiar faces from Aurora Air. The atmosphere was quiet, just the waiting. Evelyn stepped onto the platform. No opening music, no applause. It's just the footsteps and the microphone volume that's been adjusted. She stood still for a moment. She looked around the room. Then she began. "I'm not standing here because I want to be an icon," Evelyn said. Her voice was low and clear. "I'm standing here because I don't want what happened to me to happen to others." No one interrupted. No one coughed. Evelyn recounted the story. No additions, no omissions. She talked about the flight, about the hoodie, about the feeling of being asked to prove her innocence. The most painful thing, she said, is not being suspected. It's realizing that suspicion is justified. Some people bowed their heads. She didn't mention Margaret's name. No need. "I don't believe this is just one person's fault," Evelyn continued. "It's a systemic problem, a problem of learned reflexes that nobody questions." The air in the room became thick and heavy. A reporter raised their hand. "Miss Brooks," he asked, "are you calling for legal action against Aurora Air?" Evelyn shook her head. "I'm calling for something more difficult," she said. "Change. Change doesn't come from fear," she continued. "It comes from responsibility." Aisha stood at the side of the room observing. She noticed something that was rarely seen at other press conferences. Proactive silence. People aren't waiting for scandal, they're listening. An elderly woman stood up. "I was once asked to leave my seat on the train," she said. "I had no reputation, no background. Without her, what hope would we have?" Evelyn took a step down. "Hope doesn't lie with me," she said. "It lies in our refusal to accept injustice, no matter who it happens to." The room erupted in applause. Not fanatical, but genuine. At home, Margaret Hale turned off the TV. She sat still for a very long time. Don't cry. Don't get angry. It was simply a belated realization. Margaret recalled times when she said, "I'm just following the rules." For the first time, she wondered if she had used the rules to avoid looking deeper. After the press conference, Evelyn left the room through the back door. Not to hide, to breathe. She stood on the porch. A gentle breeze was blowing. Lucy walked over. "Miss Brooks," Lucy said, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to say thank you." Evelyn smiled. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "Just remember that your voice has value." Lucy nodded. Tears welled up, but she smiled. Evelyn's phone kept vibrating. Messages from James, from social organizations, from people she had never met. Not all of it is positive, but she was ready. That evening, Aurora Air issued a second announcement. It's not just about apologizing. Instead, they announced an independent reform program, mandatory training, and a community participatory oversight board. News spread quickly. It's not because of legal pressure, it's because of moral pressure. Margaret Hale read the announcement on her phone. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. She may never return to the skies as before. But for the first time, Margaret thought, if I had to start over, at least I would start with the truth. Evelyn came home late. She put the keys down. She sat down on the floor. My body is tired, but my mind is light. She didn't know where things were going to lead. All I know is that she didn't turn away. And sometimes that's the bravest act of all. 3 months have passed. No fanfare, no hype, no more trending hashtags. Time is always fair. It takes away the anger but keeps what truly matters. The mornings in San Francisco are chilly. A thin mist settled over the low-rise rooftops. The sound of a bus rumbled down the familiar slope. The city awoke to its own rhythm, unaware and uncaring of who had once been the center of attention on the internet. Evelyn Brooks was standing in the kitchen making coffee. No rush. She wore a thin sweater, her hair neatly tied back, and her bare feet touched the cold wooden floor. Her life, at least on the surface, had returned to normal, but inside things were different. Evelyn opened her laptop, not for reading the news, not for checking stocks. She opened a folder with a very simple name, Listening Sessions. Inside there's a packed schedule, community dialogues, meetings with students, frontline staff, people who have never been consulted in any of the diversity strategies. Evelyn chose this option. No speeches, no imposing, just listen. Meanwhile, at an Aurora Air Training Center outside Oakland, Lucy stood before a small classroom. She wasn't wearing a flight attendant uniform. She was wearing a simple white shirt and carrying a stack of documents. Lucy never imagined she would be standing here. We're not here to criticize anyone, Lucy said, her voice slightly shaky but clear. We're here to learn how to stop before we react. In the classroom there were faces of all ages. Some have been flying for 20 years. Others are new to the profession. They didn't argue. They weren't defensive. They are learning a skill that wasn't in the old curriculum. Listen before you jump to conclusions. Margaret Hale was sitting in the back row. No uniform, no name tags. She's just a middle-aged woman relearning how to see the world. She did not return to her previous position. Aurora Air offered a different role. It wouldn't involve direct passenger contact. It would involve joining an internal advisory team. Margaret lost many things: power, prestige, pride, but she retained something even rarer: an opportunity for real change. Margaret listened to Lucy speak. She didn't contradict her. She didn't justify herself. Just listen. In the afternoon, Evelyn was at a community college. No large posters, no protection. She sat on a wooden chair in the middle of a circle of students. A black student asked, "Aren't you afraid? Afraid that speaking out will make things worse for people like you?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She recalled the flight. She remembered the suspicious glances. She remembered the feeling of being stripped of her innocence. "Yes," she said, "I'm scared." The whole room fell silent. "But I'm even more afraid of staying silent and letting them believe that it's normal." The student nodded. No further words needed. That evening, Evelyn came home late. She was tired, but it was a pleasant kind of tiredness. She hung the gray hoodie on the coat hook. The hoodie has now been washed clean. It's folded neatly. It's no longer a media icon. It's no longer a headline. It's just a shirt. And that, for Evelyn, was the biggest victory. In her small apartment across the city, Margaret Hale was also cleaning. She threw away some old clothes, things that were associated with a version of herself she no longer wanted to maintain. She paused in front of the mirror. The mirror reflects an imperfect person. Not a hero, not a villain. It's just that humans have been wrong in the past, and we're trying to fix it. Margaret sighed. Then she smiled very slightly. Lucy received a confirmation email. She has been accepted into the internal pilot training program. She read it over and over again. Her heart was pounding. Lucy texted Evelyn, "I don't know what to say, but I know that if it weren't for that day I wouldn't have dared to dream so big." Evelyn answered very quickly, "You're not dreaming because of me. You're dreaming because you've seen something you don't want to become." Lucy smiled. Tears fell. 1 year later. No one mentioned Flight 781 on the evening news anymore, but the small changes spread. New procedures, new training, and most importantly, those previous conversations never existed. Evelyn Brooks was at the airport again. No cameras, no reporters. It was just a normal flight. She was wearing a neat jacket and carrying a backpack. When she entered the first-class cabin, no one stared. No one doubted it. A flight attendant smiled. "Welcome," he said. "Can I help you?" Evelyn smiled in response. "No," she said. "Thank you. I'm fine." She sat down in seat 1A. This time there was no climax. There is only the normalcy that everyone deserves from the beginning. Before the plane took off, Evelyn looked out the window. The runway stretched out. The guide lights came on. She thought of all the people who had texted her. Those who never get featured in the news. Those who don't have microphones. She couldn't change the past, but she helped make the present a little less harsh. And sometimes, that's all it takes. If you're listening to this story and have ever felt like you don't belong, remember this. Your value doesn't come from proving you're harmless. It comes from the fact that you exist. And if you've ever been in a position to judge, pause for a moment, because a moment of silence can sometimes change an entire life. If this story resonates with you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel and share, not to support us, but so that stories like these can continue to be told to those who need to hear them most. Thank you for staying until the very end.